Hello, SkyDivePhil. You contacted me saying that you had recently done a debate in Hyde Park with
Yeah,
Subboor Ahmad, um,
that's right.
and that's interesting to me. I mean, uh, tell me how that got set up or what that was about.
Well, it started. Well, first I contacted him because I have a friend of mine called Rob who has a channel called Speakers Corner UK, I think it's called, and he asked me to challenge him to debate the Kalam cosmological argument because that's my main shtick on my YouTube channel, SkyDivePhil. We have a lot of cosmology films. We've interviewed people like Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose, Alan Guth. And what's clear to me is that most cosmologists do not think that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. That's an outdated view. And he promoted the Kalam cosmological argument, so I challenged him to debate it, and he wasn't interested in that, even
Now,
though
who
the
was it that
videos.
was saying? Who was it was saying that the Big Bang is an outdated view?
Um, it's not that the Big Bang is an outdated view, it's that the notion that the Big Bang is the beginning of the universe is an outdated view. And
This
everyone in modern cosmology says that.
and this is your position.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm
I mean,
curious
I
about
mean
that because I did a video recently
yeah.
wherein I said that I was not. I've done actually a couple of videos where I said that I was not a big fan of Big Bang cosmology, and that the reason I'm not. In the last video, I said that the reason I wasn't a big fan was frankly probably because I don't understand it. I like that I can explain evolution, and
Yeah.
I have an I have a competence with that. But everybody, of course, every creationist immediately wants to take it back to the origin of everything.
Right.
I don't know. I never pretended to be a physicist. What do you want from me?
Right. Well,
So
what's what?
explain to me that first, because
Okay. Okay. So
I'm behind the eight ball on that one. I don't know.
one misunderstanding that is good to get out of the way is that the phrase Big Bang can have different meanings. So you can think of there's a very good article on the Max Planck Institute's website. They have a sort of sub website called Einstein Online. They've got a really good essay called A Tale of Two Big Bangs. And what they say is there's two ways that you can define the Big Bang, or at least two ways. One is to say it's the evolution of the universe from a very hot, dense state. And that is not in dispute. And I wouldn't disagree with that. And no one in cosmology seriously disagrees with that. However, there's another way to define it, which is it's the beginning of all things, that there's no space or time doesn't exist before the Big Bang. And that is the definition of the Big Bang that is out of date. That is no longer believed by contemporary cosmologists. And many of the cosmologists that have been quoted by theists to support this notion that the Big Bang is the beginning, I've interviewed. And if you watch our videos, we have a series called Before the Big Bang. And what it's about, it's competing models for what happened before the Big Bang, because the idea that there is no before the Big Bang is outdated. So we interview people like Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose, Alan Guth, Gabriel Veneziano, who invented string theory, and Abai Ashtekar, who invented the rival theory, loop quantum gravity. We interview many, many people. We've got more films coming out soon. And what the consensus position?
You're interviewing people like Stephen Hawking,
Yes,
and they're
yes,
explaining this very concept that you're talking about now. How I guess the singularity is
correct.
no
So,
longer.
so what happened was,
And
um,
one more thing. Could you move your camera ever so slightly so that that bright light is not pointing into
how's that?
it? Much better, much better. We can see you more
Okay,
clearly now. All right,
all right.
please explain that to me because I need to get
Okay,
that.
sure. Yeah, sure. So what happened was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, people worked on these things called singularity theorems, which basically say that space-time curvature, density, pressure, all these things go to infinity in a finite amount of time. And therefore, you cannot continue the backward evolution of the universe any way before this singular moment, this singularity. Now, these initial versions of these theorems had quite unrealistic assumptions. One of the really unrealistic assumption was that the universe is perfectly symmetrical. All the matter is distributed perfectly symmetrically. That's obviously not true because we have galaxies and clusters of galaxies and so on and so forth. What happened in the 1960s was that Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking developed much more robust versions of these singularity theorems that didn't require this sort of obviously wrong assumption. And it seemed to have assumptions that were obviously right. So that it had assumptions like general relativity describes the universe in its evolution, and gravity is always attractive, and things like that. What happened in at the end of the 1990s, even earlier actually, we had evidence that the universe is accelerating in its expansion. So straight away, that tells you gravity is not always attractive. So one of the key assumptions of the singularity theorem was shown to be wrong. Even before that, people had proposed a theory of cosmic origins called inflationary cosmology, which is the dominant view in cosmology today. And that also has gravitational repulsion. So the Penrose-Hawking theorems were sort of violated by these assumptions. But even if you put that assumption to one side, there are other assumptions that both Penrose and Hawking themselves agree are not valid. So with Penrose, he focuses on the idea that there's always matter in the universe. And what Penrose argues is at the very high temperatures at the Big Bang, there wouldn't be any matter. So another one of the assumptions of these singularity theorems is false. What Hawking focuses on is the idea that general relativity describes the evolution of the universe right at the Big Bang. And he says, no, that can't possibly be true. You're going to have to use quantum mechanics. So how to describe the Big Bang quantum mechanically is up for debate. And there are different approaches to quantum gravity. What's interesting, what's happened in the 21st century is that people have now developed models using different proposals for quantum gravity, like string theory, like loop quantum gravity, and there are some others. Hajava, Lifshitz gravity is another one. And they all seem to be coming back with the same answer. The Big Bang is not the beginning. Now, of course, we don't know that these competing models like string theory, loop quantum gravity are correct. They have not been checked by empirical data. But the fact that they're all coming back with this same answer at least means that the idea that the Big Bang is the beginning of the universe is no longer believed by contemporary cosmologists.
So one of the arguments that I would frequently hear, because I'm arguing with creationists all the time, and of course they all want to go on to what was popularly described Lawrence Krauss's most deceptive title ever, "The Universe from Nothing."
Right. Yeah.
Not even he believes in an absolute philosophical nothing. So right away, they know the title of the book, and so they're going to tell you think everything came from nothing. No, and nobody does. And Victor Stenger, a friend of mine, actually said that that we have lots of good theories to explain how we get a universe from nothing. But again, even he also clarified that he doesn't believe in an absolute philosophical nothing, and he doesn't mean a literal nothing.
Well, I think
the way that creationists would.
Well, there are different models of the Big Bang. That's what our video series is all about. Before the Big Bang, it's all about competing models, because we do know there was some type of Big Bang event that we know with high confidence. Not as high confident as evolution, but because we've got about 4 independent lines of evidence for Big Bang cosmology, and I think we have dozens of independent lines of evidence for evolution. So it's not on the same ballpark, but we do have many independent lines of evidence. So there was some type of Big Bang event, but what was the nature of that event? Now that's debated. The closest we have, I think, to a model of a universe from nothing is one developed by Alex Vilenkin, who is often quoted by theists as saying, "Oh, we've proved the universe had a beginning." What they don't often quote is that he thinks it could have come from nothing. Now, what he means by nothing, see, a lot of people have criticized Krauss, even atheist philosophers have criticized Krauss as saying, well, you're saying nothing, but what you mean is the quantum vacuum.
Exactly.
Now, I think that criticism is actually false. And the reason that the criticism is false is because the model proposed by Alex Vilenkin is what his idea is that if you treat space-time quantum mechanics, so in quantum mechanics, particles can sort of spontaneously pop into existence from the vacuum, but you might say, well, there's still a vacuum. Okay, there's still something. And what Vilenkin suggests is that space-time itself could spontaneously fluctuate from a state where there was no space-time. There's no vacuum at all. There's no space or time. And that is a speculative hypothesis. It might be true, but I think that's the closest to nothing. But in this case, there would still, in some sense, be the laws of physics existing in some sort of Platonic sense. So is that nothing? It's certainly there are no things. There's no matter. There's not even space and time in this scenario. But it is.
For a lot of these creationists, it comes down to the philosophical question of why is there something rather than nothing, and so they are trying to perceive an absolute nothing, where there are no laws, there's not even empty space,
Right.
there's not even the color black, there's
Right.
absolutely nothing.
Right. Well, to me, the answer to that conundrum, in my personal opinion, is that I think it's based on a false premise. And the false premise is that the default state of existence should be absolute nothingness. Well, we've never observed absolute nothingness anywhere, obviously. So why should that be? I mean, it's like asking the question, why is the universe not a giant orange? Well, why should it be a giant orange? Right?
Yeah.
Why should absolute nothingness be the default state of existence? That, to me, there's no reason to suppose that. The other thing I might suggest is
Using the idea of a multiverse. I mean,
right.
think about if there was absolutely nothing anywhere, there'd be absolutely nothing everywhere. Because if you have anything anywhere, then you have something somewhere, and then that it's not absolutely nothing. I hope that made some sense. But
Yes.
the concept, you can't have an absolute nothing.
Well, it's certainly hard to imagine. Well, we can speculate about these sorts of things. What we can say, I think, with confidence is we do know there was some type of Big Bang event, but we don't know whether it was the beginning. And we don't know that there ever was an absolute nothingness. And even if there was a beginning to the universe, that doesn't mean that the universe sprang from nothing. It might be the case. Vilenkin's model suggests that if we define nothing as the absence of space and time and matter, but we don't know it to be the case. And there are plenty of models of the universe where the universe existed eternally into the past. And we explore many of those models in our series with the creators of those models. So this isn't us talking. It's us going to interview these cosmologists, Roger Penrose, Alan Guth, and so on and so forth, Stephen Hawking, and they explain those models in our series. But to sort of come back to the debate with Suboor,
Well, I
I
got another question on that. I want you to get,
ahead.
if you would please, we'll put links down to anything you think is relevant. We'll put those in the description below. But I would like a link to an explanation for the current model of the what is accepted for the model for the
Okay. Well,
the
let me
origin of
just
the
explain what's
emergence of the.
accepted and then what's controversial. So obviously, what's accepted by, I think, all serious cosmologists. I mean, of course, I say all serious. There's always going to be a handful of people that won't accept anything. But what is the consensus in cosmology today is that the universe did evolve from a very hot, dense state.
And when you
Okay,
say
so
evolve, you're talking about stellar, like stellar evolution, where it's one star changing over time, because that's how I understand the
yes,
of that.
yeah. The universe is expanding, and when we say expanding, what we mean is, I mean, maybe a better word, I think, is actually stretching, because some people might understand the word expanding as increasing in size, whereas actually the universe could have been infinite even at the Big Bang. What we mean is that the distance between distant galaxies is stretching. So that's what we mean when we say the universe is expanding. And if we can trace
I
that
went
back
through
into.
a debate with a creationist who's trying to ridicule scientists, and he says that the scientists told him that it's not that the galaxies are moving further apart, it's that the distance between them is getting greater, and he didn't understand that, but that's literally what it is the space between them is inflating. But of course,
Anyway,
he wasn't able to
stretching. Inflation
comprehend
is
that.
is a term we use for the leading model of early universe cosmology, how galaxy structure formed. This is the leading model, and it's also what leads many cosmologists to think there's a multiverse. So these two things are tied up. If you watch our video before the Big Bang, episode 4, subtitle "Eternal Inflation: The Multiverse," we interview Alan Guth, who invented inflation, and many other cosmologists who worked on it. And we explained all the details about inflationary cosmology. So it's only distant galaxies that are moving apart, because nearby galaxies, the gravitational forces between them bind them together, and the expansion universe cannot outweigh that or outcompete that, I should say. So actually, then our nearby galaxies are not moving apart. In fact, the nearest big galaxy, Andromeda, is actually on a collision course with us, and we will collide with it in a
So
few
I just
billion
want to
years.
clarify that what you're saying is that there are no, as you put it, serious cosmologists. The consensus is not that the universe uh, evolved from nothing. Would that be fair to say?
Correct.
Okay.
That is not a consensus position. That's, yeah, and even Lawrence Krauss, he doesn't say this is something we know to be true. He just thinks it's a plausible model, and that's fine. I don't think he's ever claimed this is, correct. To my knowledge, he hasn't made that claim. So
I've already seen comments from both Stenger and Krauss to say that when they say nothing, they don't mean that an absolute nothing, that they're and I can't remember how they're phrased it, so I'll just let it go. But
well, I think in Vilenkin's model,
none of these people, even the people who make the statement that the universe came from nothing, don't actually mean that the universe came from literally nothing.
Well, I think at the minimum you would have laws of physics. So it depends how you define nothing. So I think you can say the universe came from nothing if by what you mean nothing is no matter, no space or time. That would be maybe a definition of nothing, but there are still laws of physics in this case. So it depends on what you mean by nothing. I think it's a fair debating point as to what you mean by the word nothing. But the more important point is that everyone's in broad agreement to what happened if we go back, roughly 14 billion years. The universe was in a very hot, dense state. If we imagine that there was a singularity, then up to about 10 to the minus 32, maybe about 10 to the minus 30 seconds after the singularity, actually there's pretty broad agreement as to what happened. When we get to sort of 10 to the minus 36 seconds, you get into the inflationary period. That's supposed to last sort of 10 to the minus 36 to 10 to the minus 32 seconds. Inflation is broadly accepted, but there's some significant cosmologists that dispute it. But it is the main view of cosmologists. But there are a few non-crazy cosmologists that say no, there wasn't any inflation. So that's a minority view, that there wasn't inflation, but it's a minority view. And we do make some films with people like Roger Penrose and others that suggest alternatives to inflation. And then, but let's suppose there was inflation. What happened before inflation is completely open, right? That's really a wide open field.
There is consensus. Not that it is absolute fact, but that there is consensus that there was an inflationary period, that the universe.
I would say that is okay. So what I would say is there is a consensus, but it's not like human-chimp common ancestry, what I was debating with Suboor, and we'll come on to. I think human-chimp common ancestry is accepted by every serious scientist in the field. Whereas inflation is not accepted by every serious scientist in the field. It is accepted by most. So I would describe it as a consensus, but it's not one of these things where the community has no serious controversy. And the controversy is really like in evolution, human-chimp common ancestry. That's a controversy that is a social controversy between scientists and, religious zealots. With inflation, it's not really like that. There are some serious scientists who have some serious problems with inflation. It is the dominant view. It is the consensus position, but it's not unanimous, shall we say.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm satisfied with that. And I want to thank you for that, because
no problem.
It's just something that comes up all the time.
It does. And one of the reasons we're keen to make these cosmology videos is I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Big Bang and what it really means. And a lot of people think it means beginning of the universe, but it doesn't necessarily mean that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I got into a discussion with a number of professional cosmologists once upon a time, about 20 years ago, and I was encouraged when they told me that no, we know all of this information from this point on pretty well, and they weren't even certain about that. I'm like, we're pretty sure this is what it was up to this point, as you said, negative whatever in the seconds or the fractions of a second, and so, but prior to that, no idea. So
right. There's a very good phrase by Sean Carroll, who said something like, the Big Bang is not the beginning of the universe, it's the end of our understanding. So we can just trace the universe back to here, and what happened before here, we don't know. Now, there were these theorems that said there's nothing before here, this is the beginning of the universe, but those theorems aren't really taken that seriously as valid.
If I could throw out one more crackpot thing, because I mean, obviously, I've already stated I don't know what I'm talking about here, but if I could just throw one thing out, one of the things I liked was that reading that that supermassive gravity affects time, slows down time. So if
Correct.
you have all the matter in the universe in this hot, dense state, and as you said, that you already have physical laws, then wouldn't it be that at the moment that that the time slows down, the more you have this mass, or the more compressed the mass is, until you have an asymptote on a Cartesian coordinate system, such that 1 second slows down until 1 second equals infinity when t equals 0.
Right. Well, this is the assumption of the singularity theorems, but the singularity theorems are known to be questionable, shall we say, and they're not trusted by anyone in the field as far as I shouldn't say that maybe, but what I should say is the consensus position is the singularity theorems are not to be trusted. And that's not just a few people saying that, that's the consensus. And in particular, I've interviewed Penrose and Hawking that came up with the robust versions of these theorems. And even they say that. People can watch our videos with them and they say that.
So I liked when cosmologists were telling me that they themselves don't actually know and that nobody really understands this.
Right. So let's assume inflation happened.
Really like that. That's one of the things I like about science.
Yeah.
When as a child, I mean, if you had all the answers just laid out, if everybody already knew everything,
right,
where's the thrill of exploring anything?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why we're really excited about this video series, because it's at the edge, it's at the cutting edge. We don't know what happened before the Big Bang. And so there's lots of it, but it's not. In fact, I came up with this phrase and then I saw Sean Carroll give a talk and he had the same phrase. It's not that we have no idea. The problem is we have lots of ideas and we don't know which one is right. So we have plenty of very interesting proposals.
I just heard you say something else that is of interest to me, and you said it was something about before the Big Bang. So
yeah,
there are models that allow for a
Absolutely.
before the Big Bang.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I would say the dominant view in contemporary cosmology today is that there was a before the Big Bang, which that wasn't the case maybe 20 years ago. Up until the end of the 20th century, the dominant view was that the notion of before the Big Bang made no sense.
Yeah,
that it was like saying what's north of the North Pole. Exactly. Right, that was the dominant view, and Roger Penrose would argue that view, and he says now I've changed my mind. And I think the view of cosmologists today is that there was a before the Big Bang, but I think they're agreeing on that. What they don't agree on mostly is what was before the Big Bang. But I do think what's interesting. So the idea, the dominant view is that in order to understand what happened at the Big Bang, you're going to need a quantum theory of gravity. So this is something that combines general relativity and quantum theory. And the problem is we don't have a quantum theory of gravity that is tested and agreed upon and well developed and so on and so forth. So what we do have, though, are different proposals for quantum gravity. So if you like, sort of sketches of ideas for what this theory of quantum gravity looks like. So people will have heard of string theory. That's very famous. There's also an alternative called loop quantum gravity. And there are other alternatives. Another one is called Harjava-Lifshitz gravity. What is very interesting is that people have now, in the 21st century, have taken these proposals and made models of the Big Bang using these different approaches. And what seems to me, from interviewing all these people, to be that there's a theme that keeps popping out again and again and again, and that is that the Big Bang was actually a big bounce, that before the Big Bang was a contracting universe and then it bounced back out. And this is something that loop quantum cosmology is very clear about. This is what happened. In string theory, the situation is slightly more complicated because there have been different models of the Big Bang inspired by string theory, but they seem to say that again and again. Harjava-Lifshitz gravity is in a similar position. So this idea of a big bounce seems to be a very common theme in these quantum gravity theories. So I think
that leads to two more questions. One is I thought that the Big Bang Big Crunch had been more or less discredited. And
let me address that. So what we've discovered since 1998 is the universe is accelerating in its expansion. So that rules out, given a certain condition that the universe is going to recollapse. However, that doesn't mean it didn't recollapse in the past. It didn't collapse in the past. So what you would have is not a cyclic universe doing this, but you could have what you might call an hourglass universe. So on our side of the Big Bang, it expands out forever. And on the other side of the Big Bang, it contracts, from forever. So there's nothing inconsistent about that. So this hourglass universe would be perfectly consistent with the view that the universe is accelerating in its expansion, will never recollapse. Basically, the way I put it is, I'm not going to turn into a baby, but that doesn't mean I wasn't a baby. So similarly, the fact that the universe is not going to recollapse doesn't mean that it didn't collapse in the past. Now, having said that, this all assumes that dark energy is a constant, so a cosmological constant. But we don't know that to be true. And in fact, there is some hints that it might not be a constant. Of course, this is still very uncertain. So if dark energy is not a constant, then it could change over time and it could recollapse. And also on top of that, there are some cyclic schemes which actually assume the universe will never recollapse, which is hard to get your head around, because the obvious way to think of a cyclic universe is that there's enough matter in the universe, it recollapses, it bounces, comes back out, bounces, comes back out. There are some cyclic models that don't have that as the assumption. And Roger Penrose, for example, has a cyclic cosmology where he assumes the universe is always expanding, which is very hard to get your head around. And I think you'll have to watch our video with Roger Penrose to explain it more thoroughly.
One of the concepts that I had was like, as Sagan tried to explain in the original Cosmos, when you try to pass a three-dimensional object through two-dimensional space, what would you appear like? And I liken that to, you're walking through one of those one of those scanners that that shades through your entire body. So you appear as a point at nothing, and then there's a point of something, and then it becomes broad and distorted. It assumes your whole shape, and then shrinks back down again into nothing. That you are that what could be happening is that we have fourth dimensional space time that's inflating a three-dimensional universe, perhaps.
Well, the universe, I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, and cosmologists are debating them. But we do think the universe is 4 dimensions of space-time, 3 of space, 1 of time.
Well, I mean,
of course, it's always possible there are extra dimensions of space. That's assumed in string theory. Whether it's true or not, we don't know.
Well, that brings me to my other question. I also didn't have a lot of credence for string theory.
Okay, well, that's debated. I mean, what's interesting is not that string theory is saying this, but what's interesting is that the alternative theories are saying the same thing, that the Big Bang is not the beginning. So you don't have to buy into string theory to take this view. If you take the rival theory, loop quantum gravity, that's much more unambiguously saying the universe had a bounce. In string theory, it's a bit more subtle, because people have made different models of the Big Bang using string theory. Whereas in loop quantum cosmology, there's much more consensus that the bounce is a sort of a definite consequence of loop quantum gravity.
Well,
sorry. So you don't have to buy into string theory to take this view.
Okay, very good. I mean, and I must apologize, because we came on here to talk about your debate with Suboor, and it opened up a whole nother can of worms that I had to dive into. So
of course. Yeah. So what happened was I challenged him to defend the kalam, and he refused. And then later on, I was in the park. I go to this. So for people that don't know Speaker's Corner, it's this area in London where on Sundays there's always people arguing with each other about politics and religion. In recent years, there's been a lot of Muslims there proselytizing, and often Christians debating with them, or to a lesser extent atheists debating with them. It's a lot of shouting, but occasionally you get a good debate there. A lot of the time it's just sort of shouting, but you do often have interesting debates there, but more often than not it's just crazy.
I went to Hyde Park looking forward to the debate confrontation, and I knew that there would be a lot of Muslims there, and I thought, well, this is good, because we don't get this in the United States a lot.
Right.
We don't have congregations of Muslims where that I could come up that I could come and address like this.
Right.
So I was looking forward to that in Hyde Park, and we brought a couple cameras, and it was just useless. I mean, there was no way to get any good sound. Nothing was intelligible. It was just everybody shouting at everybody, and
Right. Well, I do
couldn't
think, yeah,
very
I think
disappointing.
so. What's happened actually? I don't know how long this has been going on. Not that long. But now everyone is. If you have a conversation at Speakers Corner, it's recorded, and people have better microphones and cameras. And we did with I think the debate has very good sound, and it's all completely intelligible. So that's not a problem. But and Suboor and I. So basically, I'd been to the park and I'd said good things about evolution. And he then challenged me to defend it. And what I said was, well, let's speak about human-chimp common ancestry, because what I think, in some cases, he hides is the fact that he can't accept human-chimp common ancestry. That's the one aspect of evolutionary theory that he says is in conflict with his faith. Whereas he did a debate with this guy, Professor Pritchard, I forget his first name, and he sort of glossed over that. He didn't really focus on that. And they did another debate with another guy in Sydney, and again, sort of glossed over that. But this is the thing that's really, to me, is the really important aspect, because it's the one thing he says the Quran cannot accept, and or Islam cannot accept, or at least his version of Islam, we should say. It's to me the thing that has overwhelming evidence and no serious disputes about. So yeah, we had that debate, and people can watch that. It's on my channel. If you go on the SkyDivePhil channel, the debate is there. And shall I tell you a little bit about what went down?
Yeah, I saw a bit of it, and I could tell that you were going over like certain loci of particular identified mutations and such. And from what I can tell is, while you're doing this, and you would be making salient points to scientists, but I mean, his eyes, for example, were just glazed over.
Yeah.
And I would bet that many of the other Muslims in the immediate vicinity would have been reacting the same.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, he didn't address. I brought up some, I think, very strong evidence for. I'm going to say evolution now, just as a bracket term. What we were really debating was human-chimp common ancestry, but rather than me having to say that every time, I'm going to say evolution. So hopefully you understand when I say that. That's what I mean in this case.
And the difficult thing with debating with Suboor, I mean, because I had a debate with Suboor in Houston, and the whole problem there was he depended on misdefinition. He was using the fallacy of equivocation was his entire argument, because he wanted to debate that evolution was microevolution. When he says evolution, he means microevolution, and when he says Darwinism, he means macroevolution. And so he's,
well,
how do you argue that? He says, oh, no, I agree with evolution entirely. I just don't like Darwinism. What the hell is that?
Well, there is a distinction, I think. What he does in some of his videos is dispute whether natural selection is the driver of evolution. And so he'll try and appeal to biologists that dispute that. But that is a separate question, in my mind, to whether humans and chimps share a common ancestor. So if you believed, for example, that Lamarckian evolution was the truth, then that doesn't undermine human-chimp common ancestry. Humans and chimps could have a common ancestor via Lamarckian evolution. It depends how you define Lamarckian evolution, of course.
Lamarckian evolution.
I think the original version that Lamarck had did have separate ancestry. But what my point is that, well, in fact, it's interesting because some of the scientists and philosophers that he quotes all say that that there's two statements that Darwin really wanted to push. Is that one is that the theory of special creation is wrong, and that we have descent with modification, and two, that what causes that is natural selection. Yeah. Now, if it's true that natural selection is wrong, it doesn't follow that descent with modification is wrong. So let's
if I could throw in my 2 cents on that. Darwin had a mechanism. He proposed the first working mechanism of evolution, but he had no idea about mutations, and he didn't understand genetics, and he tried to postulate something called gemules, which turned out to be invalid. And if only they had mass communication, or if they only had direct communication, because Gregor Mendel, while Darwin was still alive, Mendel had
Yeah.
figured out the
Right.
answer to Darwin's dilemma. What is
Right.
causing these mutations, or what is
Yeah.
causing the variance? Because he
Right.
realized that natural selection can't cause the variation. It can just select the variation when it arrives.
Right.
And so
Right.
Mendel came up with the mutations. And that, I think the modern argument would be that while natural selection does actually have an effect, there's a number of instances where we can show that there would be selective pressures. That doesn't account for most of biodiversity, in fact. And so genetic drift is actually far more important than natural selection is.
Well, in some cases, I think. I mean, you have to look at it case by case. But the point I want to make is that let's suppose all of evolution would occur by genetic drift and none via natural selection. Suppose that were true, it wouldn't undermine common ancestry. These, in fact, the very people that he quotes. So one of the people that he quoted in your debate, and he quoted to me, is a guy called Elliot Sober, who's a philosopher of biology. And he says the theory of natural selection and the theory of common ancestry are logically independent of each other. So if you were to defeat one, you haven't defeated the other. And the point about Suboor is that he's saying really what he can't accept as a Muslim is the theory of human-chimp common ancestry. So any criticism that he has when he quotes, let's say he's got people who say, no, natural selection is not the main driver, it's epigenetics, let's say. Right? Let's suppose that was valid. Let's suppose that was valid. It wouldn't help him, because the key thing that he can't accept is human-chimp common ancestry. And if it's the case that epigenetics is a bigger driver, which I don't think is true, right? And he misquotes the epigeneticist. So, for example, he's got this person called Eva Jablonka, and he says, Jablonka is saying here's an alternative to natural selection. But actually, Jablonka doesn't say that. She's saying it's supplemental, right? So it's another mechanism. And of course, he's shooting himself in the foot, because now I know a lot of biologists will say epigenetics, I don't know what your view is not that important in evolution because it doesn't last enough generations. But let's just suppose
epigenetics is when outside features or outside factors can turn on or activate certain genes, like smoking, for example, can cause the activation of some of your particular genes, and your exposure to sunlight, will also do the same thing. But these don't, as you said, they don't pass down generations. These are not inherited mutations. They're governed by the environment. So it doesn't factor for evolution much at all.
Right. My understanding is that they can go more than one generation, but not a lot more than one generation is the problem. So they can't be important in evolution. But let's just suppose that's wrong, right? Suppose that's wrong. What you would then have is another mechanism for evolution to happen. And what he does is as a way to cast doubt on Darwinism, he brings up, this didn't happen in our debate, by the way, but this is what he does in his videos, is he brings up alternative mechanisms for evolution, like epigenetics. But to me, he's shooting himself in the foot, because if there's more ways for something to happen, it's more likely to happen, right? So it's not helping him. But I don't think he understands that. But nevertheless, we didn't really talk about that because I wanted to focus on human-chimp common ancestry, which, as I said, is so important because it's the one aspect of evolution that he has clearly said he cannot accept as a Muslim. And that's what we have. And all these people that he quotes, like Eva Jablonka and many others, that he thinks are, doubting natural selection, they don't doubt human-chimp common ancestry.
He did the same thing in our debate, where he quoted somebody, and then there was a student of that person in the audience who came up to me during the break, and she said he's misrepresenting what that's not what the professor said, and or that the professor clarified this is not what he meant, or whatever. Right. It was being deliberately misrepresented.
Yeah, there's two really big misrepresentations that I recall from your debate. I mean, there's more than two, trust me, but there's two that really stick out in my mind. So one is he quoted Douglas Theobald, who had a paper in Nature called Formal Test of Universal Common Ancestry. And what Douglas Theobald said was the theory of universal common ancestry had never been or rarely, it was either never or rarely been formally tested. And that's the first bit of the abstract. What he didn't quote was the next bit of the abstract, was now we have a way to formally test it. And we have done, and the answer is universal common ancestry is correct. And in fact, the probability of it being incorrect, they established as, I think it was 1 × 10 to the power 2,860 to 1. So pretty damn likely. And he forgot to mention this bit, so he's, a lot of times the scientific paper is set up as, oh, there's a problem, and then here we go, we're solving the problem. And what he quotes is the beginning bit and not the bit that says, yeah, we've solved it.
Like the most often misquoted line that the creationists ever do is when Darwin said, I freely admit that the evolution of the eye from, simple to complex and so forth,
Right.
Is absurd, seems absurd to the highest possible degree. And they cut it off there.
Right.
And then they completely knowingly skip where he says, but reason tells me, and then goes on for 4 pages explaining the solution to that problem.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in this case, I don't know whether he knowingly skips it. What I imagine, and this is a guess, I don't know if this is correct. He reads that bit and he goes, aha, bing, that helps me. I'm going to quote that, and never bothers to read the next bit.
Yeah, well, I know he lies a little bit because he said that he read my book, for example, but he made it clear in the debate that what he actually did was did a Control F search for a particular word. And missed the 2 places where I described exactly that phenomenon, but didn't use that word in either of those places.
Right. Well, in fact, you came up in the debate because what I wanted to do with Suboor was do a formal debate where we swapped statements ahead of time. I've done this with a debate in Texas I did with a Christian theologian called John Ferrer. And I think that's a very fair way to do a debate, because then everyone can check the claims that other people, you've got time to check. In a live debate, you don't have time to check what people are saying. William Lane Craig did this with a couple of the debates he's done. I think one of the most recent ones he did with a moral philosopher whose name skips me for the moment. But they swapped, every statement was swapped. Like they had 2 weeks to write their response. And that's what I proposed to do with Suboor. And he went, no, I only debate academics in a formal debating setting. And I said, well, you debated Aaron, and if you read the preface from his book, you clearly state, you're self-educated mostly, and there's nothing wrong with that. Darwin's MA was in theology, right? Darwin doesn't have any qualifications in natural sciences. But so, anyway, yeah, he does misquote. The other misquote I really want to focus on is this guy's Sober. So he quotes, and he quoted it, I think, in your debate, where he says something like, well, I have the debate, I have the quote. So with your permission, I'll read it out.
Sure.
So let me see if I can find it here. Hang on. Here we go. So Elliot Sober. So this is the bit that Suboor quotes, and he says, both of the following thoughts are therefore naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they are similar. Humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. And that's what he quotes. So now what I'm going to do is read the next bit. Okay? Because when you read the next bit, you'll see how utterly disingenuous this quote is. So, right, let's carry on with the quote. But in addition, the transitions from degree of similarity to a claim about common ancestry versus separate ancestry in both examples must be mediated by information about the process generating the traits in question. We have seen the sameness of character state always favors the common ancestry hypothesis over separate ancestry hypothesis if the assumptions described in S4.4 hold. I won't bother with that because it won't matter. This is true whether the traits are dichotomous or multi-state. In this respect, all similarities are on the same page. But here's the key point. That's just me speaking now. Right, back to the quote. This is really important. But what type of similarity provides strong evidence for common ancestry over separate ancestry, and which provide evidence that, though positive, is relatively weak? In The Origin of Species, Darwin answers this question in a way that makes a great deal of sense. And then he quotes Darwin. And the quote from Darwin is this: adaptive characteristics, although of the utmost importance to the welfare of the being, are almost valueless to the systemist. For animals belonging to the most distinct lines of descent, many readily become adapted to similar conditions and thus assume a close external resemblance. But such resemblance will not reveal, will rather tend to conceal their blood relationships to to their proper line of descent. And that's close quote from Darwin. And then Suboor goes on to comment, that is why the torpedo shape found in sharks and dolphins does not provide strong evidence for their having a common ancestor. Natural selection favors this shape in large aquatic predators, so we'd expect it to be present in modern sharks and dolphins, regardless of whether they have a common ancestor. In contrast, the gill slits found in human embryos and in many fish are evidence of common ancestry precisely because they have no adaptive utility in human embryos. The term vestigial carries the double meaning that Darwin intended. Vestigial traits are useless to the organism and they are vestiges of a bygone age. By recognizing they are useless, we see they provide substantial information about the past, close quote. So you see the point that Suboor's making is you can't just look at similarities in adaptive traits and assume common ancestry. And that's what Suboor quotes, right? But what he doesn't quote is the next bit that says, but you can look at similarities in non-adaptive traits and get common ancestry from that. Yeah, and that's something I pointed out in the debate.
I would argue also that and I have to point this out, that the quote that you just read is actually factually false. That vestigial traits are not necessarily useless. They are diminished. Oh, stop. They are diminished, perhaps reduced, but not necessarily useless. And the pharyngeal, what he's calling gill slits, are now called gill arches or gill pouches or pharyngeal arches or whatever. These actually do have some. When you said that there's no adaptive ability, yeah, they do. They follow the Evo-Devo pattern of recognizing parallels between evolutionary development and embryological development. I have to say that I have to clarify all this for the audience listening, that these pharyngeal arches would in fish develop into gills, just like in our ancestors they did. But then as the fish evolved, the ear bones changed position, where the organs that were the gills became tonsils and so forth, and so that's exactly what these things evolve into or develop into in the human embryo. So I have to clarify, there are a number of vestigial traits that have a function that's just a greatly reduced function, and probably the best example of that would be our canines. We still have them, just like all cynodonts do, but they're obviously greatly reduced from our ancestry.
Well, my own view is that the argument is right. Whether that example is right is another issue. But I think the argument is correct. So what the example that I gave was the NanoP8 pseudogene. Okay, so these genes have lost their original function, and that's really what we need to make this argument work. And I think for the most part they are non-functional. But even if they acquired a new function, the point is that they don't have their original function.
Yeah, there are vestigial organs that are completely or vestigial organs or vestigial traits that are unambiguously completely useless.
Well, okay, so that's all Suboor would need for his argument. That's all Suboor would need for his argument. So whether it's true for that particular piece of anatomy is not really the point, in my opinion.
Right.
The point is that they've lost their original function. So if we agree on that, then we're fine. But the point I really want to make is that you can see that he's misquoting Elliot Suboor, right? He is saying one thing and Suboor is quoting him as saying another thing. What Suboor is saying is we can't infer it from this, but we can infer it from this. And Suboor just quotes this bit, the bit where he says, well, we can't infer it from that. And Suboor takes from that we can't infer a common ancestry, but that's not what Suboor said. And there's another quote from Suboor where he says, in the very book that Suboor quotes, where he says, no competent biologist now doubts that human beings and chimps have a common ancestor. And to me, that's the key, right? He's basically saying that's the part of evolutionary theory that he can't accept. And that's the part that his own source says is agreed upon by the entire field. And in fact, there's so many more misquotes. Shall I go on to another one?
Oh yeah. I just want to throw in one other thing. I once wrote a letter to Richard Leakey, because somebody had quoted a whole bunch of scientists, obviously misquoted all these scientists. And I
Yeah.
went and looked up the original content of each one of the quotes. Every one of them was a case like what you're describing there, where
Yeah.
what the scientist is actually saying is the opposite of the little snippet that they were quoted in saying.
Yeah.
That they always do the clarification thing after,
Right.
but and they always cut out the but thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wrote to Richard Leakey explaining this because I couldn't find the original for his quote, the quote that
Right.
they attributed to him. And
Mhm.
so I asked him, what did you actually say, or what did you mean, or where can I find it, or whatever? And
Yeah.
he wrote back to say that it's best just to ignore these people because misquotation is the hallmark of their work.
Right.
And he also said the creationists were astonishingly stupid,
Yeah.
which I loved, and I kept that quote from my email. But the comment that misquotation is the hallmark of their work is absolutely true. Every time you get into a creationist argument, they always quote what some scientist said, always
Yeah.
part of what the scientist said, and never the
Right.
whole thing.
Well, of course, I mean, no one can quote the whole thing. I mean, that's, but in this case, they couldn't quote the next passage.
And you
Right.
have to wonder if when these people they do this, they have to at some point know that they're doing this. So it's
Well, that I'm not so
okay.
sure about, because I think in human psychology, we convince ourselves of that we're right. I mean, there's a very interesting body of research in how people reason, and often they've got a pre-existing view and they've just looked for evidence that confirms it. So what I'm going to guess happens, as I said, is that you look for a passage that you think confirms your view, and then you're done. You don't read the next bit because you think you've got something. So that's a possibility. I don't know.
Thing, you're looking for whatever quotes you can get. I know that a lot of these people, they have to have read the whole damn book. They didn't read up to "but reason tells me" and then not see what reason tells me. They know
Well,
that next
someone
part of the
probably
quote is
didn't
there.
read. Someone probably read the whole book, but then they put out the misquote, and then everyone just quotes the misquote. They never read the whole book. So
Well, Suboor had clearly not read my book when he said he did. So I mean, I
right. Well, the next book the next author he quotes is this guy Jonathan Marks, and what Jonathan Marks. So basically, I presented some genetic evidence that I think is overwhelming, and in particular, a paper which was in Nature, which was the Chimpanzee Genome Consortium, and when they sequenced the chimpanzee genome, they wrote in the abstract more. I can't remember the exact words, but it's something like, more than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley posited that human beings share common ancestry with African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this hypothesis. I think I've got that pretty damn spot on, but you can look at the paper and see. So I quoted that, and then I showed what some of the evidence was. One of his responses, I'll go over both of his responses actually, but one of his responses was to quote this guy Jonathan Marks, who's an anthropologist. And what he said is, let me see. He says, this is the quote from Jonathan Marks. He says, "What does genetics have to say about all this? Nothing. Sameness, otherness is a philosophical paradox that is resolved by argument, not by data. Genetic data tells us precisely what we already knew. The humans are both very similar to and different from the great apes." So that's the quote, right? But what Suboor doesn't understand is what is really meant by that quote. And in fact, if I give you another quote from Jonathan Marks from a talk that he gave recently in his most recent book, I think it's called X Ape or something like that. So let me quote that, and then I think you'll understand what Marx is saying, and I'll elaborate. And so this is now a quote from Jonathan Marks in a talk he gave. So beginning quote: "Our most recent ancestor diverged from the apes and evolved into walking, talking people. What are we? We are not apes, as our ancestors were. We are ex-apes." And then he goes on to say, "Biological anthropology has made two major breakthroughs in the last couple of centuries. First, in the 19th century, we discovered we were descended from apes. Second, in the 20th century, we discovered race and human variation are different things." So the point that Jonathan Marks is making, so basically what Marx's view is this: people like Jane Goodall and others that in his view overemphasize the similarities between humans and chimps are wrong. That we are not apes, that we are significantly different from the chimps, and to people that say, "Oh, we're so similar," they're wrong. Okay, now that's an interesting question. How similar are we? That is a philosophical question that I agree, can't really be resolved by genetics, or at least not yet. However, it's a completely separate question to whether we descended from a common ancestor with the other apes. And Marx clearly says that we do. That's why he has the phrase, "We are not apes, but we are descended from apes." And he goes on to say something like, "We are not fish, but we are descended from fish. We have a common ancestor with fish, but we are not fish."
Now
Right?
that's an important, another thing that I have to bring up for I think some of my listeners, is that when he says we're not fish, okay, great. If we understand that in cladistics, there are a lot of people can embrace that we are apes, that we are defined as apes. Obviously, this guy, he has a different definition of apes,
Right.
that is some non-human requirement, just
Right.
like the fish he excludes.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe but that's a paraphyletic classification. I'm a cladist, so I have to accept that, we are really weird monkey fish.
Right. But I mean, okay, when someone says humans are apes, I mean, in a sense, you're just debating a label, right?
Yeah.
And what he's talking about is the meaning of the similarity, right? How similar are we? Are we so similar that the differences between us are trivial, or are the differences between us very significant? And that is, to me, a philosophical question.
The reason that I have to take a cladistic point of view is that the only definition, the only consistent definition of what an ape is, includes humans.
Okay, that's completely fair. I mean, to me, it's just a separate debate. The point that Marx is making is nothing to do with what Suboor thinks he's making. Marx is not saying that humans and apes don't share a common ancestor. In fact, he says they do share a common ancestor. What Marx is saying is that the difference between humans and chimps is more significant than what other people say. Now, so my point is that Suboor is completely misquoting this guy, and he hasn't understood what his argument is, or if he does understood it, then I think he's completely dishonestly quoting it. So it's one of the two, and I don't know which. But it's either not understanding or it's dishonesty. I can't think of a third possibility. Nothing springs to mind. It's one of the two. He's clearly misunderstood. Another person that he misquoted is a guy called Henry. Well, I'm told it's pronounced G, and Suboor thinks it's pronounced G, but whatever. And he claims, so first off, some trivial thing, which is not that important, but I'll just address it. He claims he's the senior editor of Nature and an atheist. Now, first off, he isn't the senior editor of Nature, because Nature has like dozens of senior editors. So he's trying to inflate this guy's status, but he is a senior editor of Nature. Now, whether he's an atheist, he's said many times, "I believe in God." So to me, that means he's not an atheist. Now, Suboor did come up with a quote after the debate saying, "With respect to the science debate, I'm an atheist." Now, exactly what he meant by that, I'm not sure, but that was a secondary
he's
quote.
being secular. He's not.
Yeah, it could well be. He just means on that debate, I'm with the atheist. I mean, but he has said he believes in God. Now, it could be that he flip-flops his position, whatever. But the point is, he's trying to mold this source to make it look like it's better for him, when he hasn't really, done his homework. But the more important thing is Henry G or G does not dispute common ancestry, does not dispute evolution. What he does, he's got this book called The Accidental Species, and he makes some comments and some arguments about misconstruals of evolutionary theory in the popular media. And one of the big beefs, if you like, that Henry, I'm going to just say Henry, to avoid the issue of his pronunciation of his surname. One of the beefs he has is that he thinks that particular fossils cannot be said to be our ancestors. You can't look at that fossil and say that's our ancestor. And that's something I completely agree with. But it doesn't mean...
I agree with you as well, but I just want to point out that the case of Homo erectus is a unique one in paleontology, in that is one time that we can say that our species definitely evolved from that species and not from any other species. We know it was that one. Now, you can never pin down the individual, of course. You can only pin down the species, but in most of paleontology, they will say, okay, this is structurally basal to us, and you would say that it is potentially ancestral. You know that it has all
Right.
the forms of, but like with Australopithecines, for example, we've got Afarensis, Africanus, and half a dozen others. And how could we ever know that we're not going to find Sediba, and it turns out to be closer,
Well, and also there could be another species that was our ancestor that didn't fossilize. So it could be there were a bunch of different species that were very similar to each other. I mean, humans and Neanderthals are pretty damn similar. And that's the one that was our ancestor didn't fossilize. So we just find a one that's very similar to us, but it wasn't actually our ancestor. And this is what Henry is saying. So now, to me, that doesn't undermine human-chimp common ancestry, because one of the things we look for to see if human-chimp common ancestry is true is the patterns in the fossil record. So what I pointed out was, if you plot out all the hominid species, their skulls that have been discovered over time, what you find is that there is this generally increasing over time size of the skull. So if you look at Australopithecus, it has a skull that's a bit bigger than a chimp, but not a lot. If you then look at later Australopithecus, they're a bit bigger again. If you look at Homo erectus, the earlier ones are bigger still, the later ones are bigger still. You do see this upward trend, right? And then, so that trend, that overall picture of the data certainly provides strong evidence for human-chimp common ancestry, because we do think that the brain is something that, grew over time. And we do have fossils that confirm that picture. So let's just say that you're wrong, that Homo erectus is not the ancestor. Let's just say hypothetically, right? It wouldn't, whatever you dispute about that, it doesn't say anything about what the overall picture of the data says. The overall picture of data clearly confirms the evolutionary picture. And Henry Gee says that clearly, right? He's very, very clear that the fossil evidence confirms evolution. And in fact, he said, let me just find the quote, in the very book that Suboor quotes, he says, let's see if we can find it. He says, evolution is demonstrated by the existence of fossils and the community of all life. And he also, Nature did this thing, anniversary of Darwin, and it was, they did this whole insight into the origins. And this is a quote from him. The articles in this insight testify to the success of Charles Darwin's theory of descent with modification by means of natural selection, carefully detailed in his book On the Origin of Species almost 150 years ago. The most striking aspect of the theory is its simplicity. Given heritable variation, a superabundance of offsprings, and environmental change, natural selection must happen and evolution will follow. So clearly he's misquoting this guy, because what Henry is attacking people that misrepresent paleontology, and what his field is paleontology. And he also, one of the other things that I brought up was this trend in the fossil record of increasing brain size. And Suboor replied, you're making the fallacy of the assumption of a great chain of being. And this is something that is attacked in this book, The Accidental Species. And again, Suboor has shown his complete misunderstanding, because the great chain of being, in my understanding, is to say that some species is on top and the another species is on the bottom. There's a ranking of species. And you can't say humans are better than chimps because we have bigger brains, but that doesn't mean you can't say we have bigger brains, right? Chimps have their own qualities that they are good at, I wouldn't be able to beat a chimp in a fight, right? So I can't say that my bigger brain makes me better than a chimp any more than they can say their more powerful muscles makes them better. So yes, I agree the great chain of being is wrong, but that doesn't in any, and Suboor literally thought that if you've got this transition from smaller brain to bigger brain, that's in conflict with the notion that the great chain of being is wrong. But that just shows that he doesn't understand the great chain of being, and he doesn't understand what the fossils say.
Well, that's what I commonly see with creationists trying to argue their point, is that there's a very deliberate attempt to not understand. That's the thing. I mean, I could explore, and I think most people who hold the scientific position have tried to explore religion with an open mind, to consider whether there's any truth to this, and we just come away wanting. That's how we get into this position. But with religious belief, it works exactly the opposite. And I find that's just psychologically, it's always exactly the opposite. But with religious belief, they don't want to believe it, so they don't want to understand it, because if you understand it, then you'll accept it, and that'll challenge your religious belief. So you have to make sure you don't understand it, which means you have to misrepresent it.
Well, there's a well, I don't want to second guess people's psychology. So it's.
I'm just saying this is what it seems to me.
Right.
And
Okay.
I
mean, and not all religious people are the same. I mean, like, if people go on my channel, the most recent debate I had is the one with Suboor, but there's one I did just before that, which is a debate with a guy called Randall Rouser, and he's a Christian theologian. And the debate was on the topic of, does the millions of years of animal suffering undermine God? And this is something I'm quite well known for, because William Lane Craig, the Christian theologian, made some pseudoscience argument to counter this. And I did a video with many of the leading scientists in the field saying, busting his pseudoscience. And
again, for my listeners, you made this video debating this other guy. You're not even talking about William Lane Craig, but William Lane Craig makes a video to try to rebut you.
He did. Yeah. So basically so just to give you the background, William Lane Craig did a debate with a humanist philosopher called Stephen Law. And he made this claim that animals are not aware that they're in pain because they don't have a prefrontal cortex, and only the higher primates have a prefrontal cortex. So I made a video interviewing neuroscientists who said, one, animals do have a prefrontal cortex, and two, you don't need a prefrontal cortex for pain awareness. So that was and then he did a response, and then I did a response, and then I did a radio show with his source author, who's a very influential guy, a guy called Michael Murray. The reason why he's so influential, he's basically the director of programs for the Templeton Foundation. Now, for those that don't know what the Templeton Foundation is, it's an organization that has huge amounts of money, and that has been accused of basically promoting an agenda which is to try and create a false impression that science and religion are bedfellows. And he is basically very high up in this organization. Or director of programs is his title. So I understand it. He basically decides what gets funded and what doesn't. That's my understanding anyway. So I debated him. And in fact, what's interesting is that in preparation for that debate, I wrote to some of the scientists that I'd quoted and materials that I'd used. And one of them wrote back to me, and he was like, why are you asking me about this stuff? And I explained to him why. And he was really keen to help me. And eventually he said, let's write a paper on this. So we've actually written a paper, which is myself, a neuroscientist, a philosopher of consciousness, and a pain researcher. And we've just submitted it to a journal, and they have accepted it for peer review, and it's now going through the peer review process. And I am the lead author on the paper. So we're basically, yeah, we're going to destroy Craig and his fellows on this topic. But anyway, the point I wanted to make was, when I debated this other guy, Randall Rouser, he's a Christian, but he was very honest. He didn't do any misquoting of scientists. And in fact, he condemned William Lane Craig for his pseudoscience bullshit. So I thought, yes, you don't have to be dishonest to be a theist, and you don't have to do this sort of tactic that Suboor and others do of misquoting scientists. Randall Rouser, I disagreed with him, but there was no point where I thought you're misquoting the science at any point. So it doesn't have to be that way, but obviously often it is, and certainly in Suboor's case it is, and certainly in William Lane Craig's case it is. So you don't have to do all these misquotes, but I think, I mean, so maybe these misquotes are from misunderstanding, or maybe it's deliberate deception. I think it's hard for us to tell, but whatever it is, they're misquotes. So and there's a clear sort of misunderstanding, and also just inconsistency. So another inconsistency that I want to highlight that came up in the debate was that, so when I brought up the genetic evidence, the other response that he gave was, oh, look, we were told by, evolutionists that there's all this junk DNA. And now we've discovered that it's not. There is no junk DNA. It's all functional. And I think this shows that Suboor doesn't understand how science works. Because to me, the way science works is, you make a claim and you have to jump through certain hoops for it to be accepted. So if you're going to bring to a debate a statement that science has discovered this, then there should be certain things that have happened. So one, you should have that claim in a peer-reviewed journal, but that's not all you have to do. Then what has to happen is other scientists have to review that claim and either confirm it or reject it. And what's happened to me with the human-chimp evolution claim, that claim was made in a paper that I quoted in 2005. There have been, I think, 1,700 citations to that paper. And I asked him to bring me one paper in a high-impact journal that says the conclusion of human-chimp common ancestry is wrong. And he couldn't quote even one single paper. And I think that's telling. But then he quotes this paper that says, oh, the notion of junk DNA is wrong. But what he doesn't understand is other people then reviewed that claim once that paper came out and said it's bullshit. There is lots of junk DNA. In fact, many molecular biologists were very, very critical of the paper that claimed that junk DNA is, well, they said 80% of the DNA is functional. And what most biologists, as my understanding, you see what I'd like to see what you say about this, is that paper completely misunderstood the notion of function, that they had a different definition of function, which is not what evolutionary biologists mean. And they also, I mean, there's actually, in fact, it'd be useful to read for your viewers one of the review papers on the paper that said, you know, most of the DNA is not junk. So this was a paper in Genome Biology and Evolution, and this is what they said. They said, this absurd conclusion, and that's they're referring to the idea that 80% of the genome is not junk. This absurd conclusion was reached through various means, chiefly by employing the seldom used causal role definition of biological function and then applying it inconsistently to different biochemical properties, by committing a logical fallacy known as affirming the consequence, by failing to appreciate the crucial difference between junk DNA and garbage DNA, by using analytical methods that yield biased errors and inflate estimates of functionality, by favoring statistical sensitivity over specificity, and by emphasizing statistical significance rather than magnitude of effect. Here we detail the many logical and methodological transgressions involved in assigning functionality to almost every nucleotide in the human genome. The ENCODE results were predicted by one of its authors to necessitate the rewriting of textbooks. We agree. Many textbooks dealing with marketing, mass media hype, and public narrations may well have to be rewritten. An interesting Scientific American did an article on it where they actually quoted one of the authors of the ENCODE paper, the one that said a lot of the genome is not junk. And he said, let me quote you from it. He said, the major criticism is that the project's lead scientists overstep their conclusions, especially in publicizing the idea that much of the human genome was potentially necessary to human life. Such determinations aren't supported by the science ENCODE did, critics say, and offer the public an inaccurate idea of how genetics and evolution work. ENCODE inevitably ended up recording certain regions as active and functional that likely don't do anything important in the body. ENCODE's definition of functional does not have anything to do with certain regions ENCODE's definition of functional does not have anything to do with why certain regions might be important or what exactly the regions are doing for human health, says John Stemiotonopoulos, a genomics researcher at the University of Washington, Seattle, and one of ENCODE's senior scientists. So, you know, it shows to me he doesn't understand how science works. He's quoting something that has gone for review by the community, as it were, and has been rejected, and that he accepts as fact. Whereas something else, which has gone to the review of the community and been accepted, he doesn't accept.
I mean, it's like I said, where religion reverses everything. I mean, we have scientists who are going to be speculative, or not speculative. They're hesitant, they're tentative, and scientists will change their minds. As you pointed out a number of times, right. Scientists will disagree about each other about sometimes, and can even convince others to change their minds so that their positions can change.
Right.
But with the religious position, they can't.
Right.
I mean, they have to remain rigid, and even to the point where they know they're wrong.
Yeah.
Because they give it all up.
Well, certainly,
it's an all or nothing kind of thing with these people.
Well, certainly his religious views are like that. So, I mean, he takes the Quran, I presume, literally, because he says the Quran says, you know, God created Adam separately, therefore they can't have common ancestry with chips. Now, of course, it is possible for someone to take a very liberal interpretation of their religious text and say, no, it's all metaphor, in which case they could embrace the science, you know. But for someone who takes it literally, no, they if the science says otherwise, they won't accept the science. Now, then what they do is they come up with philosophical problems with the science. Like they think like Suboor's big thing is, oh, well, it's not a sense, and it's not a fact in the absolute sense. But to me, that's a complete abuse of the definition of fact. And in fact, he has quoted Stephen Jay Gould on occasion. And Gould has a great definition of fact where he says it's not something that we know for certain, but it's something where, all the evidence, when he points to, I can't remember the exact quote, I do have it somewhere, but, that's the point. I don't know anyone in science that thinks scientific fact means 100% certain beyond any doubt and can never be revised. That's not what we mean. What we mean is overwhelming evidence points to it.
My definition of fact would be a little different, and I think importantly that I have to interject it.
Okay.
That my definition of fact is simply objectively verifiable data.
Okay. I mean, I think Gould has
context in it.
Let me see if I can pull up Gould's quote here. Oh, hang on. Sorry,
when people the reason that I use the definition that I do is because I think that's the most accurate. It's the most precisely accurate that I can come up with.
Right.
It also addresses the people who say, "Well, I know for a fact there's a God."
Right.
If you can't demonstrate any of your conclusions to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you don't actually know that.
Right. Well, here's the thing. Right. So what they want to say is, and Suboor has said this. He quoted, some philosophers of science, claiming that science can never be sure of things, and I think that's true. There's always possibility of a revision to what we think, but that's true in philosophy as well, right? It's not like philosophy gives you concrete conclusions that cannot be escaped, right? And Suboor makes this big deal, and many of his colleagues at IERA, the organization that he's associated with, will say a deductive argument is always going to be an inductive argument, and science uses induction, but we're using deduction, right? Now, the problem here is that deductive arguments have assumptions that can be false and could be revised. So yes, it's true that if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows, but you never know for sure that the premises are true, right? So, you don't really have this giant gap between deductive and inductive arguments. That's a fallacy, because the deductive arguments are always based on premises that may or may not be true, right? So if you take the classic example of what's in every philosophy textbook, you have Socrates is, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So that has to be true if the premises are true. Okay. But how do you know the premises are true? How do you know all men are mortal? But you know that inductively, right? You look at people and you see that they don't die, right? So you're using induction actually to come to a deductive argument, to deductive conclusion. So this distinction between the deductive and inductive argument that Suboor and his colleagues make a big deal of is false. Right. And in fact, Suboor uses a kalam argument, and so does his colleague Hamza Sources, and so of other Muslims. And the kalam argument has two assumptions. The universe began to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, how do we know the universe began to exist? He quotes the science, which he doesn't think is a fact, right? Because he's basically saying all science has the problem of induction. Well, then your deductive argument doesn't work, does it? Because you're using an assumption that's been arrived at by induction. So his whole shtick just is completely in contradiction to itself. I think he just hasn't thought this stuff through at all. And it's completely, and in fact, he said in one of his other videos that imagine you're watching a crime show, the DNA evidence comes in, and it says, okay, the accused is a match with the DNA. We know that for certain, all right? And that's the certainty that evolutionists want us to have about evolution. Well, no, they don't have that kind of certainty. Evolution is based off probabilistic reasoning. Well, wake up call, Suboor. DNA evidence is also based off probabilistic reasoning. When you go to a criminal trial, they give you something called the RMP. It's called the random match probability. So it says, what is the chances that the DNA sample that we've got matches the accused by chance, that he wasn't actually there, but there's just a chance matching all these DNA features? Well, there's the general level for a case in law, as I understand it, is 1 in a billion. So if they say it's 1 in a billion chance or higher, then we say, okay, the DNA evidence clearly points to the accused, right? That's probabilistic, right? So things he accepts are also probabilistic, and all human knowledge is open to revision, right? Philosophical argument included. So if he wants to say, in fact, he now tells me that he's not a realist but an idealist. Well, that's someone, you know, that won't accept things that you can't basically see, right? So why doesn't he have the same skepticism of evolutionary science as he does with God? And the answer he gives is, well, because we got to God via an inductive argument. Yeah, but your inductive arguments have, sorry, via deductive arguments. But yeah, but the point is your deductive arguments have assumptions that are probabilistic. So you're being completely and utterly inconsistent. That's what I would say.
Right. Well, this was a pleasant hour and a half discussion. I want to put a link to your channel, SkyDivePhil YouTube channel.
Yep.
And the specific items that we were talking about, if there are specific videos that
yeah, there's a few I want to highlight that I think are very interesting to the atheist-theist debate. So one in particular is a film we did called Before the Big Bang, episode 4, Eternal Inflation of the Multiverse, because it explains the scientific case of the multiverse. And also there's a theorem that many theists quote to say the universe must have had a beginning. It's called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. And we interview Alan Guth, one of the authors of this theorem, and we ask him, does your theorem prove that the universe had a beginning? And he very clearly says, no, it doesn't. And in fact, he says, I think the universe didn't have a beginning, as it is eternal into the past. So that's very interesting to people interested in theist-atheist debates. The other ones that I think will be particularly interesting to your audience would be the ones on animal suffering. So if you go on playlists, you'll see that that's the back and forth I had with William Lane Craig about animal suffering. I think this is an incredibly strong argument for atheism, because a lot of people highlight the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, but they focus on human suffering. And a lot of theologians have responses. And when you focus on animals, what you find is those responses fall flat, that they just don't work. So, you know, the classic response is Adam and Eve, you know, caused suffering to come into the world. And a lot of theologians now, not, you know, they're not all young earth creationists. A lot of them will say, no, we accept the age of the earth and the scientific, you know, timeline of the world. And then you say, okay, well, if you accept that, what are you going to say about the hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering that happened before Adam and Eve came around? And of course, we don't think Adam and Eve ever existed, but, you know, let's put that aside. So those are the videos that I think would be of particular interest to your audience.
All right, we'll be happy to put those links in. And SkyDivePhil, a very pleasant conversation. I want to do another one if I could just keep up when you get into the cosmology thing.
Okay. Well, then we can reschedule that. Yeah, why don't you watch some of the videos?
I will.
Before the Big Bang series, and then when you've watched them, we can come back and have a chat, you know, clear up things and point things out that you think are important. One of the other things I should also point out is that a lot of the cosmologists we interview do not take the fine-tuning seriously. They say there is no fine-tuning. And in fact, it's some of the same cosmologists that have been quoted as supporting it. One in particular is actually, before we go, sorry, is Sir Roger Penrose. He's the one that they quote the most, I think, for saying fine-tuning is this huge problem. And we interviewed him. He says, "Oh, I don't believe there is any fine-tuning."
So there's no fine-tuning. The universe didn't evolve, and it didn't come from nothing.
Well, no. I don't want to say that. I'm saying some of the people that they quote as saying there's a strong problem of fine-tuning don't think so. And the universe certainly did evolve, but it wasn't necessarily from a state where there was an absolute beginning.
Now you got to define what you mean by evolve now.
Well, what I mean is
we're talking about evolution, and
I think let's do that in another episode, shall we? Watch the videos, come back, and we'll talk about it. How's that?
All right.
All right. Thanks a lot for the chat, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thank you much.
Bye-bye.